I'm going to use our website instead of a PowerPoint presentation because, first of all of the information that you need actually is on the website, and you can go back to that again and again in order to, sort of get some of your questions answered. And the other advantage of that is that you start to become familiar with how things are laid out on the website. So it gives you a chance to learn a little bit about that, to see me moving around the website, showing you where things are. So I hope that that's helpful. So the page that you're looking at right now is the main Resilient Communities Fund page. And you get to that by going to What We Fund in this blue bar, and you click on Resilient Communities Fund, and this is the page, the first page you'll see. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of the page and show you a section around where you can get support. Because we have a number of different avenues for you to be able to get support. First of all, we have our support center team, and they're an amazing team. They're incredibly helpful, particularly with any technical questions you might have in terms of the online grant application. If you need to add a contact person or change a contact person, the support center team would be your go-to. So down here at the bottom of the main Resilient Communities Fund page, you can see that there's a link to their email, which is otf@otf.ca, or you can call our toll-free number. So that information is always there at the bottom of the main page for you to access. We also will be offering coaching clinics or webinars. Webinars are obvious what they are, but coaching clinics are not unlike what we're doing here today, which is maybe smaller group Q&A sessions via teleconference sometimes. Both webinars and coaching clinics are led by a program manager. And we're currently working on our schedule for the next deadline. And I expect that we'll start delivering sessions maybe mid to late October for the December 2nd deadline. And you can also catch up on that by checking here at the bottom. Have questions, need support? We will have a link here where you can click and register for one of those sessions. And then another type of support that we offer is a coaching call or a coaching appointment. And that's a one-on-one telephone call with a program manager from your area, typically your geographic area. And that's an opportunity for you to ask some very, very specific questions about your project, to dive in a little deeper than you might in a public session like this. And again, under the Have Questions, Need Support, there's a link that will take you to an online scheduler. And the beauty of this online scheduler is it's very simple to use. So you'll see there's a place to put your postal code. You type your postal code in, you click Find Someone in My Area, and depending on where you're located, one program manager name will come up, sometimes maybe two. You click on a name, and you'll see their calendar, and you'll see their available appointment times. And you can look at your calendar and book something right there. There's a short form that you fill out, and with your telephone number, et cetera, not very lengthy. And you submit that, and then your appointment's booked, and the program manager will call you at that specific time. Just a note on the coaching calls. There's a big demand for this fund, as I'm sure you can imagine. And the calls aren't scheduled for a very long period of time. They're scheduled for 15 minutes. So it's important that you be ready for the session. Be prepared to describe the impact of COVID on your organization, and also to provide a short summary of your project, what it is you want to apply for, and to have your questions ready. And then that will help the program manager very quickly get up to speed on what you're working on, and then be able to answer your questions in an informed way. So, how do applicants access the grant application? This is an online application, as I mentioned. At some point, approximately 30 days before the December 2nd deadline, a button will appear on this Resilient Communities Fund page. Not sure exactly what it says. It might say apply now or something like that, but in any case, there will be a button, and when you click on it, that will take you to the grant application. However, you can start drafting your grant application now. You don't have to wait for the online version to be ready. So again, on the main Resilient Communities Fund page, if we scroll down again to about the middle of the page, you'll see something here right above the questions and needs support, the Resilient Communities Fund resources. And you will see a link to a PDF of the grant application. So what that allows you to do is to see what the questions are, start gathering your information. You can start storing it offline in Microsoft Word or something like that. And then when it's available online, then you're able to go and copy and paste your answers into each of the fields or tick whatever boxes you might need to tick to answer questions. The grant application is divided into two main sections. We start with a series of questions about your organization. And then once you've completed that section and submitted it, then you'll see the project portion of the application and the questions related to the specific project that you're asking for. So let me just go to the PDF of the grant application. I'm trying not to scroll too quickly because I know that can be bothersome for people. Okay, so if you are new to the Ontario Trillium Foundation, you haven't applied in recent years, you haven't registered with us, then at the beginning, when you first click on that apply button, you're going to have to submit some basic information. That includes your organization's operating name, your organization contact name and their email address, your signatory contact name and their email address, and you submit that. And once submitted, then by email, you will receive your login credentials, and then you can log into your portal and into a grant application. If you're a returning applicant or grantee, you're going to need to update your organizational information. So you will see the information you may have entered for a previous deadline, for example, in there, but you're going to need to review it, and you're going to need to probably update it. So some of the things that you need to pay attention to is to ensure that you update your most recent financial statements, to make sure that your board of directors information is up to date. Any new members need to be added, and make sure that any members who stayed on the board, that their grant terms are active. In other words, they haven't expired. So you need to make sure that everything is current, and also any organization contact details. You'll need to make sure that that's there. If you don't know your username or password, and this sometimes happens for organizations that are already in the system, maybe the previous contact person has since left the organization and the information's been lost, call our support center at that toll-free number, and they will help you sort it out. So that's what you need to do. You can if you know your username and forgot your password, there's a link there that you can request a new password, and you'll get one by email. I just want to scroll down to a little further past some of these basic questions that you need to answer. The bottom of page 2 of the PDF here, we asked you for your mission statement, so that's fairly self-explanatory. But we also ask you to tell us what your organization's typical activities are, the programs and services that you provide, the number of people who benefit from your programs. And it's important to note that this information is important to provide our assessors with the context of what your organization does in order to better understand what the impacts of COVID-19 have been on those programs and services. So do provide us a fulsome description of what your organization does. What type of programs or services do you provide, and to whom? How frequently do you provide those activities to the community? How many people participate in your programs? How many individuals do you serve annually? That kind of information is all very helpful to help our volunteers understand your organization. And like I said, it provides some context for when later in the application you're describing the impacts of COVID-19 on your organization and on your programs and services. I want to talk a little bit about eligibility, because this really is the first step that you have to take. So some organizations are eligible and some are not, sadly. So confirming your organization's eligibility as early as possible is really important, because it's going to prevent you from lost time. If you're not eligible, if your organization's not eligible, then you could do a bunch of work on a grant application that actually isn't going to move forward. Or it can also provide you with more time to gather additional information that might demonstrate your eligibility. So this is a really important step one. Make sure that your organization is eligible. The eligibility policy is here on the main Resilient Communities Fund page under who is eligible to apply. And so you can, have a look at that. I'll just quickly go to that and show you that policy, because there's something in here I want to just show you about who's eligible. So it starts with what types of organizations are eligible. There's also information here that would be important to an organization that perhaps is located outside of Ontario but provides services in Ontario. And then it also lists ineligible applicants. So if you have a look at those two lists, that will start to give you a better idea of whether or not your organization is eligible. Be sure also to have a look at this anti-discrimination policy. So that's also listed there on the main Resilient Communities Fund page underneath the eligibility policy. You want to be able to honestly check the declaration that asks you to confirm that your organization will adhere to that anti-discrimination policy. So in order and good conscience to be able to do that, it's really important that you read and understand that policy, and that it's something that you can agree to should you get a grant. I want to talk a little bit about the board of directors now. In order to be eligible, your organization has to have a minimum of at least 3 active board members. So that's the minimum, and active means their terms are not expired. In addition, at least 50% of your board members must maintain an arm's length relationship to each other. So basically what this means is that board members and any executive positions in the organization are not married or related to each other, do not work as business partners, or otherwise in a relationship where interests may be compromised. So this is really about potential conflict of interest. So at least half of your board members have to be at arm's length. In other words, not have any conflicts of interest with each other or with any executive staff members. You're going to be asked, if you haven't registered with us before, to enter in the first name, the last name, the start date of that board member's term, the end date, their position on the board, which could be member, or maybe they're the chair or whatever. And then you have to indicate whether or not they are at arm's length. You have to do this for each board member. So answer yes if the member does not have any conflicts of interest. In other words, they are at arm's length, everybody. Answer no if the member isn't at arm's length, if they are related or closely connected with another board member. So again, just a reminder for those of you who have registered or applied to us before, make sure you check those term end dates and make sure that everything's accurate in your board of directors list. I want to go down and I want to talk now about the financial statement requirements, because this is really important. There were quite a number of grant applications that were declined in this last round because the financial statements were incomplete or the financial statements were not the correct financial statements that needed to be submitted. So this is really important to pay attention to ensure that your organization is eligible and that your application can move forward in the assessment process and have an opportunity to be funded. You must submit your organization's most recent completed financial statements. Those statements must have been completed within a year, 1 year of the fiscal year end date. So let me give you a couple of examples. If your fiscal year end is March 31st, you can submit the statements for March 31st, 2020, if those are completed and ready to go and approved by the board. If they're not, then you could submit the March 31st, 2019 statements. So we've created a bit of flexibility for those of you who know us around the statement issue. If your fiscal year end is December 31st and your December 31st, 2019 statements are ready to go, they're approved by the board, they're finalized, that's great, submit those. If they're not ready, we will allow you to submit the December 31st, 2018 statements. So completed statements means that they're final. They've been approved by your board of directors, and they must include an operating statement, which is a statement of your revenues and expenses for each of the last 2 years. So your statements need to include the financial information for the last 2 years, whichever set you submit. They must include a balance sheet with your assets and liabilities. And they must also include any notes that were included, prepared by that were put in there by the person who prepared your statements. I just want to point out here that we have a resource here for you, the financial statement requirements. It's on the main page under who is eligible to apply here. And it'd be important for you to have a close look at those. And I'm just going to pull those up for you so you can see them. So there's really good and clear information in these financial statement requirements, one of which is that depending on your gross income, your gross income will define what type of statements you need to submit. Let me put it that way. So for example, we will accept internally produced statements if your organization has a gross income of, say, less than $50,000 or $49,999. However, if your income is above the threshold, then you may need to submit notice to reader statements or a review engagement report. And either of those need to be prepared by a licensed public accountant who's external to your organization. So those have to be prepared, and we'll only accept them if they're prepared by a licensed public accountant. Similarly, if you're required to submit an audit, then those audited statements need to be prepared by a licensed public accountant from outside your organization. I had a few files last round where it was a notice to reader statement, but they were prepared by someone who was a bookkeeper, or they were prepared by someone who was a tax consultant. And neither of they couldn't be accepted because they have to be prepared by a licensed public accountant. So this is something that you're going to need to have a look at as soon as possible, and make sure that you have the appropriate set of financial statements. If you have any questions about that, then it's important that you call the support center. They can help you with that, or book a coaching call with a program manager, so they can help you sort out whether you have the right set of financial statements to be able to submit a grant application. I'd like to also point out here in the requirements document, the financial requirements document, there's a link to the financial need and health policy. And so it's important that your organization is able to demonstrate need for OTF funding, as well as the ability and capacity to manage the grant funds if you're approved. If your organization has an accumulated surplus of more than 12 months of operating expenses, then you may not be able to demonstrate need unless you can provide a rationale that some or all of those funds are earmarked for an imminent project. If you have an accumulated deficit that is more than 10% of 1 year's operating income, you may not demonstrate capacity to manage a grant unless you provide an explanation for how the deficit occurred and a deficit reduction plan with timelines and targets. So if either of the above is true for your organization, you must upload either the surplus rationale or the deficit reduction plan along with your financial statements. That's the point at which you need to upload that information. On our website, there also is, pardon me. Let me go back to the financial statement requirements. And we'll scroll to the bottom. Halfway down page 2, you will see a link to something called the financial position calculator. That's on our website. I'll show it to you right now. And it allows you to enter some basic financial data from your last set of financial statements and give you a bit of an idea of whether you're falling under the 12 months of accumulated surplus or below the 10% accumulated deficit range. And so it's just a bit of a tool to help you sort that out. And by all means, contact a program manager and set up a coaching call so that you can talk about that if you're unsure about it. Once you've completed the organizational information, you'll move on to the project portion of the grant application. So let's start by looking at a bit of information about the Resilient Communities Fund. I'm going to go back to the main page here. So this is a one-time fund to support the not-for-profit sector to recover and rebuild from the impacts of COVID-19 on your organization's programs and services. We want you to be able to effectively meet the needs of your community, and COVID-19 has certainly gotten in the way of all of you being able to do that effectively. So this is aimed more at a medium to long-term recovery effort versus an emergency fund. I know we had some emergency funds that came out and may still be around from the federal and provincial governments, for example. But this fund really is about more medium to long-term recovery. We want to help organizations stabilize their programs and services and their organization and help to rebuild organizational capacity for the not-for-profit sector. The minimum that you can apply for is $5,000 and the maximum is $150,000. The maximum grant term is 12 months or 1 year. The next deadline is December 2nd at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And I highly recommend, I always do this, that you set your own deadline for 2 to 3 days before our official deadline and work really hard to achieve it. Trying to submit your application on the deadline date, particularly later in the afternoon, means that, first of all, you're risking missing the application deadline because at 5 p.m. it shuts down. That's it, it's done. Not to mention that it's incredibly stressful and none of us does our best work when we're stressed out. So please do set an earlier deadline. That way, if something, there's a wrench that's thrown into the works for you, if you were depending on someone to get you a key piece of information and they've been delayed somehow, then you've got a bit of time to deal with it rather than trying to deal with it on the actual deadline date. We have 5 outcomes that we're aiming for with the Resilient Communities Fund. And you'll find that on the main page of the Resilient Communities Fund under what is eligible. So we will fund community-based projects, activities that support rebuilding your capacity, due specifically to COVID-19 impact. So the tie-in has to definitely be there. You have to make the case that this project is needed in order to help you deal with the impacts of COVID-19 on your organization. So let me review each of these outcomes because it's important to really dive a little deeper into these. Outcome number 1 is to equip board members and employees with supports to implement new approaches or prepare for change and build resiliency. Here are some examples, and these are examples. So you may have ideas that might not fit exactly into one of these examples, and that's okay. You just need to make the case that there is a fit with that particular outcome. So some examples of outcome number one, it could include organizational training and coaching. It could include strategic planning and or implementation, maybe research and development, or mental and physical health and well-being supports for staff, volunteers, board members. The second outcome is to improve and increase the ability of your organization to access financial resources and to develop new or perhaps alternative sources of revenue. Some examples would be to develop and or implement fundraising plans, identify fundraising or financial technology resources, to seek new opportunities, perhaps some kind of public-private partnership or maybe social finance opportunities. The third outcome is to adapt or reimagine the delivery of programs and services to meet the needs of the community, employees, and volunteers. Some examples, identifying and or implementing new health and safety processes or protocols, identifying what kind of personal protective equipment might be required or what new technology support might be required, developing and or implementing staff and volunteer recruitment and training. The fourth outcome is about procuring equipment or renovating spaces to meet the changing needs of your organization, its programs, and its services. It could include also adapting to new ways of working. Some examples would include equipment or renovations, or both, perhaps, to help you meet the changing technology needs or the health and safety needs or service delivery requirements for your organization. The fifth outcome is to create and or adopt new approaches for organizations to work together to meet the needs of communities. And I emphasize the work together, because this particular outcome is really focused on projects where organizations would be working in a more integrated and collaborative way to do things like implement peer learning or professional development opportunities or networking opportunities or resource development, knowledge sharing, data sharing types of activities. So that particular one is aimed at groups of organizations working on the project together. In your application, let me just go back there for a minute. Oh, sorry, there we go. There we go. Just going to go down to this section. There's your outcomes there in the grant application. So you must be able to describe what the impact has been on your organization of COVID-19. And we provide you with two ways to do this in the grant application. You have to do both. You have an opportunity to tick off any of this list of various impacts that we're already aware of, based on research that's been done by the Ontario Nonprofit Network and others. So you can tick off any of these that you think apply, but we ask you to elaborate on what the impact has been of COVID-19 on your organization and your ability to deliver your programs and services. This is a very critical question, and everything else in the grant application hinges on how clearly you describe what those impacts have been on your organization and your programs and the degree of impact. So be clear in your description and back it up by providing some data, if that's at all possible. So there's two ways to approach having had to cancel fundraising events. You could say we have lost revenue because we had to cancel 3 fundraising events that we would typically do in the summertime. Or you can say, we've lost X amount of money by having to cancel 3 fundraising events, and be very specific about the dollar value. You could also discuss programs that had to be suspended or scaled back, and how many of those programs, or how many lost program hours that represented, or how many fewer people were able to benefit from that program as a result. So the more specific you can be in describing the degree of impact on your organization, and I guess ultimately on the community, obviously, who can't participate, the better, the stronger your application is. Typically, in my experience, many organizations have many impacts that they can describe. And I recommend to people that you actually document all of the various impacts of COVID on your organization and on your programs, your services, your community. Because it's important to get it all down so that you have some kind of record of it. But if there have been many impacts, then you might want to focus in this particular application on the impact or impacts that you're really trying to address with this particular project, so that it's focused. So you only have 200 words, I think, for this answer. So you want to be as focused as possible and as clear as possible about describing the impacts that are the focus of this grant application. Your strategy that we're going to talk about next has to describe how you're going to go about addressing those impacts that you've described. So it needs to be as clear and as focused as possible. The next step is then to describe what your strategy is. And the strategy needs to relate directly to one or more of these outcomes. There's no advantage to choosing as many of these outcomes as you can. In fact, if you choose too many outcomes, you might not be able to describe as fulsomely and as clearly as you might hope how your strategy relates to the outcomes you've selected, and it could end up watering down your application and make it less focused. So only pick the outcomes that you feel your strategy has a strong fit with. And then when you're describing your strategy, make the link between the elements of your strategy and the outcomes that you've selected. Remember that the strategy is intended to help you rebuild your organizational capacity to respond and recover from the impacts that you've described in the first question. Once you have described your strategy, the next thing we ask you to do is to list up to 5 key project activities that you will complete in order to successfully implement the project. So one of the things that I recommend to applicants when we're talking about the activities question is it's really important actually that you do a work plan for this project, much like you would do any work plan for any project. You might have it in columns. I like to work in columns personally, but you know, sort of the main outcomes that you want to achieve in order to achieve your strategy, the activities that you need to do in chronological order perhaps, or you attach timelines to it. You figure out, okay, so here are all the activities. What do we need? What staffing do we need? What money do we need? What tools do we need? You know, do we need to evaluate at any point? And if so, what is it we're going to evaluate? And if you do that more detailed work plan first, then it's much easier for you to be able to go back to this 5 activities question and pull the main information from your work plan into your answer in this question. If you start it the other way around, if you just answer the 5 activities questions, there's a fairly good chance that it's not going to be as fulsome or as clear as it needs to be competitive. The other reason a work plan is a good idea is if you do that in more detail, then it really helps you build an accurate budget. So once you have a really clear plan on what it is you're going to do when and who's going to do it and how much, you know, what the resources are, then there's less chance that you're going to miss a key budget item that you might forget to include otherwise. So that's what I recommend to people. Develop that more detailed work plan. and then describe the 5 activities in as much detail as you can given the word count. But provide as much detail of each of the major activities as you possibly can. There's also a financial workbook that you will need to complete. And we also have financial workbook instructions. You will find those on the main Resilient Communities Fund page under the Resilient Communities Fund resources. So you'll see here we have a PDF of the grant applications, a PDF of our assessment criteria, the financial workbook instructions are here, and then of course our financial statement requirements for your organization. So you do want to have a look at those financial workbook instructions. It lays out all the detail of what you need to know in terms of things like quotes and GST and what you can apply for and what you can't include, and whether there are maximums, such as maximum in overhead and administrative costs of 15%. And then on the second page, you will see a bit of a sample of what the financial workbook actually looks like, with some examples of how we'd like you to use the notes field. So the notes section is absolutely critical to help us understand your project. Let us know if you have a quote in the notes for something that's over 10,000, for example, and use the notes to tell us exactly how you estimated the costs in each of the main expense items. So be sure to tell us how you estimated staffing costs. So if you want to apply for a salary for a staff person, or more than one perhaps, then include their title and role, separate out different staffing positions from each other in the notes, and provide us with the number of hours per week, the dollar value that you pay them per hour, the number of weeks, plus any benefits or mandatory employer-related costs. Break it all out for us so that we understand exactly who it is you need to hire to implement the project and how you came up with the amounts. Purchase services is where you would put things like consultant fees. So again, you want to break that out in the notes. Particularly if you might need 2 different types of consultant. Maybe somebody's a technical consultant and somebody else who's maybe going to support the board with strategic planning or something. Let's break those 2 out in the notes. Tell us how you came up with the amount of money. Anything in purchase service that's over $10,000, you need to have 1 quote in hand for that. Some expense items, such as workshops, meetings, convening, or supplies and materials, often there's multiple types of items in there. Break them out in the notes so that we understand exactly what's included in that dollar amount and how you came up with each of them. Capital includes repairs, renovations, equipment that you need to purchase for the project in order to deliver the project. Again, anything over 10,000 requires that you have a quote. It's cumulative, so if you wanted to buy 10 computers at $1,000 each of them is under 10, but cumulatively they're over 10. So you would need to have a quote for that type of thing. Renovations require that you actually own the space that you're renovating, or that you have a minimum of a 5-year lease. So keep that in mind. That's an eligibility requirement. You can ask us for evaluation, but keep in mind that we don't require it for this particular fund. I know with some of our other streams in the past, seed and grow particularly, we have an expectation that you're going to do evaluation. There are some projects where that fits for this fund, particularly if you're doing major adaptations to a program. And you want to test, how effective it is compared to perhaps when you used to run it in person, then that's fair, absolutely. You can ask us for evaluation funds for up to 10% of your request amount. But if you ask us for evaluation funds, be sure that your activities include evaluation activities as well. Overhead and administrative costs, you can ask for up to 15% of your request amount to support all of those types of back-end costs that you have to pay to support these types of projects. That could include a portion of rent or utilities, a portion of your audit, perhaps, any supervisory costs. So if there's a manager who's going to be supervising the project, you would not put their salary in direct personnel. You would ask for some funds towards that under overhead and administration, and it's capped at 15%. So just a few additional tips. Double check your project's eligibility. I'm just going to go back up to the eligibility policy again. In addition to describing what type of organizations are eligible and which ones are not, that policy also describes what kinds of activities, project activities, are not eligible. So you'll notice things like the purchase of alcohol or cannabis, for example, or any political activity, or perhaps religious activities or programs specifically would not be eligible. Dollar for dollar replacement of government funding is not eligible. So once you have your project, strategy in place and you know what it is you want to apply for in terms of your financial workbook, double check this eligibility policy and just make sure that you're not asking us to fund something that may not be eligible. You can double check that with the support center or with a program manager as well. Make sure that your project is something that can reasonably be completed in 12 months or less. So this is another place where the doing a more detailed work plan would come in handy, is that if once you do your work plan and you do your timelines and if you realize, oh, maybe we're trying to smush too much into this 1 year, then you can pare it down so that it can reasonably be implemented within 12 months. Make sure that your strategy and the activities fit with the program outcomes that you've selected. You need to choose a project start date, and the start date must be between 3 and 6 months after December 2nd. So somewhere between the middle of March and the middle of June is when your project will need to start. The assessment criteria is also on our website, and you'll notice it's also embedded in the grant application. So right here's the question about the activities that we ask you to describe your 5 key project activities. You'll notice the assessment criteria is in the grant application, and it's worth 40%. And what we're assessing there is clearly outlined. So that gives you a bit of a clue as to what we're looking for each of the questions that you're going to answer. And I think I'm gonna pause there. I think I've taken a bit more than the 30 minutes I promised you, but I hope we'll have lots of time for questions yet. Daryl, how are we doing on the questions?
Sorry, Joanne. We do have a couple of questions that have come in. It looks like we've got 4 of them. Are you able to see the Q&A?
Give me 1 sec to find that.
If you can open it up, if you have access to the button at the bottom of your screen and can open that, you can see them there, or I can read them to you.
Just 1 sec. Oh, Q&A. I was looking for chat. Okay, I think I've got them, Daryl. Thank you.
No problem.
All right, so if the board member has held their position for more than 1 term, do you want the start date from just the current term or from when they originally joined the board? I would suggest that you stick to whatever the current term is. So whenever they were last elected to the board, sometimes board members are elected for 1 year each. Other boards of directors work where somebody's elected for 3 years, someone else for 2 years, someone else for 1 year. So however it works with your organization, the start date would be the point at which they were last elected for their current term, and the end date would be whenever that term will end, whether it's 1, 2, 3 years, whatever it is. Under what is eligible, when it says you can apply for one or more of the following, Can the results be combined into one request, or would the applications need to be separate? Great, great question for a couple of reasons. You can, which I actually am going to re-add to that presentation because I forgot to include it, and it's a key piece of information. Your organization can make one grant application per deadline for the Resilient Communities Fund unless you have an approved grant. So if your organization applied for the September 2nd deadline and that application gets approved, then you cannot reapply for a different project for December 2nd. If you submitted a grant application for September 2nd and it's declined, then you can submit a new application for December 2nd, either for the project that got declined or for a different project. That's up to you. You'll find out whether or not your application was declined fairly early on in November. So as early as we can complete our decision-making process, we will let everyone know right away so that those whose applications were declined will be able to perhaps call, get some feedback from us about how to strengthen the grant application and be able to turn around a new application and strengthen it and resubmit it for December 2nd. So that goes to the second part of your question. In terms of the first part of your question, you can include different elements in your strategy. So it doesn't have to be just about one impact, one strategy, one set of activities. There might be 2 or 3 key impacts that you want to address. Your strategy may have 2 or 3 elements to it that, when taken together, will help you address the impacts that you've described. That's fine. That's fine. And you might then be able to demonstrate a fit between the different elements of your strategy and 2 or 3 of the outcomes. That's okay too. It's just important that you tie it in, that you make sure that what you're applying for the strategy, that you can tie in a good fit with the outcomes that you've selected and with the purpose of the Resilient Communities Fund. So I hope I answered that question. If there's anything more, please don't hesitate to add a supplementary there. Okay, can salary for regular staff who will be reassigned partially to the new project for its duration be included, or only staff newly hired specifically for the project? Thank you. That's a really great question. So you can apply for, yes, for your current staffing, some of your current staffing to be working on this project. That's totally fine. You can do that. You can also, sometimes you might need to hire a new staff person who has different skills or a different area of expertise for this project. That's okay too, either or combination. Is overhead 15% on top of the request or 15% off the total? So for example, thank you for the example. If we applied for $10,000, would overhead be $1,500 with the rest being $8,500, or would it be $1,500 and the $10,000, so $1,150? So it's on the total. So if your total project budget, including your overhead and admin, is $10,000, then $1,500 of that can be for overhead and admin. So you might need to play around with the budget a little bit as you're trying to figure that stuff out. And understanding which category to place various staff members' salaries. A choir director delivers programming to members, but is also active in organizational planning. Would this role fall fully under staff category, or would we separate the planning portion and include that under administration? That's a really great question. Sometimes sorting out, sort of what kinds of, roles or responsibilities fall into overhead and administration versus direct personnel can be tricky. So obviously anything to do with direct programming that you're asking us to fund, that salary would go into the direct personnel. Planning, if your project is about planning and specifically doing that kind of work in order to implement your strategy or achieve your strategy, that's a project activity. So that could go also under direct personnel if there's a staff person who's going to be delivering it. However, if there's an executive director who's going to be monitoring, supervising, providing support to the choir director as they're implementing the project, those hours would go under overhead and administration. So I hope I've answered that question, Wendy, but please do add a supplementary if I've confused the issue for you. Another question, if doing a renovation, can we apply for funds to support the renovation if the overall has already started? So could we apply for a part of the renovation that would not start until 3 to 6 months after December 2nd? That's a bit of a tricky question. I'm going to suggest that, Amy, that you schedule a coaching appointment so that you could talk with the program manager in a bit more detail about that. It's hard to answer the question without knowing more of the details of the project. But sometimes large capital projects can be staged. If they're very, very big, they can be staged. And so there might be some possibility of that. But again, I really recommend you talk with the program manager so that we can dive into the details a little bit. All right. I don't think we have any open questions. Please don't be shy. This is a great opportunity for you to ask questions and hear other questions that are asked as well. While we're waiting to see if there are any more questions.
Maybe I can jump in with a question. I was curious, how similar to this this granting process, how similar to the normal OTF process is it, or are there significant differences somewhere? And if so, what are they?
Are you asking about the assessment processes, Daryl?
No, I think I'm asking, I mean, it could be the assessment process, but it could be the application process. I'm curious, for people who are familiar with writing Trillium grants already, how similar of a process is the Resilience Fund, or are there significant differences somewhere that they should be aware of?
There are a few. There are a few. So in terms of some of our requirements, so for example, the size of the accumulated deficit that we'll accept without a deficit reduction plan, that's been bumped up from 5% to 10% for this fund, because we understand that organizations are struggling. The financial requirements have also been made more flexible, as I outlined in my presentation. And again, that's because many organizations have been significantly delayed in being able to finalize their financial statements or hold their annual general meetings, for example. The grow capital and seed streams were very, very tied to our action areas and the priority outcomes and the grant results that we had with for those streams under our investment strategy. And those priority outcomes and grant results aren't applicable in this stream. Excuse me. We ask applicants in the grant application to choose one of the 6 action areas, and that's as far as it goes. So, and it's really choosing the action area that you think your organization's typical activities best fit with, and that's it. It's not being that investment strategy, the action areas, the grant results, that's not being used to assess these grant applications. The only thing we're using to assess the these grant applications are those 5 outcomes and the degree of fit between the impact, the strategy to address the impacts, the activities, and the budget that are going to be implemented to achieve the strategy, and how all 3 of those things connect up with the outcomes for this fund. That's really our focus. I'm going to actually go to the assessment criteria to show everybody this, because it's not just about the assessment criteria that we're using. This is actually a description of what the steps are that we go through when we're assessing a grant application for the Resilient Communities Fund. So we start with eligibility, and a staff member looks at every application and determines whether or not the organization is eligible. We review the financial statements and assess them. We review any, if there's a deficit reduction plan or a surplus rationale, we review that. We look at the board of directors, and we look at the granting history for the organization, if they have one. And we do all of that to determine whether or not the organization is eligible. Then we take a look at the project eligibility. So again, we take a look at some of our policies, the anti-discrimination policy, the capital grants policy, which, by the way, you should have a close look at if you are applying for capital equipment or renovations. Make sure you look at that policy as well. We look at the eligibility policy and the overhead and administrative cost policy and make sure that the project complies with those policies, basically. And then we're also looking to see how well the impacts that the organization has described are actually related to COVID-19. So again, that needs to be very clear in that question. And we look to see whether the project fits with the Resilient Communities Fund and what we're hoping to achieve. All those things being good, then we work on the project assessment itself. And so you'll see with the assessment criteria, there are 3 assessment areas. We have the impact on the organization. That's worth 10% of the final score. Strategy, 50% of the final score. And your process, which is your activities and your project budget, 40%. So we're very transparent on what it is we're considering when we're scoring the application, and it's a good check for applicants actually. Once you have a good final draft done, is to go back and take a look at the assessment criteria and try to line it up and figure out whether you've done everything you can to make a strong case for your project. I don't know, did that answer your question, Daryl?
Oh, absolutely, and then some. So thank you very much. And I love that you guys put your decision-making criteria very transparent for people. That I think that's extremely helpful. Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
Super. Thanks for the question.
Joanne, we do have one more question in the Q&A that is
Yep.
on, if you would like to take a look.
Yep, I see it. So I'll read the question for everyone. When I attended the last workshop for the regular Trillium in Peterborough earlier this year, I've lost track of time, haven't we all? You had mentioned that applications from outside of Toronto have a good chance of approval, excuse me, because most applications come from within the city and you like to spread the funding around. Is it the same for this grant? That's a really great question because you brought up the question of sort of allocations and budgets and that sort of thing. So that's a good question. So just to clarify, we have 16 catchment areas, geographic areas that we call catchment areas in the province. City of Toronto has its own catchment. They're one geographic area. They have a pretty big budget because they have a lot of people in Toronto, and part of the way we figure out the allocation budgets is by population per capita. So they have quite a bit of money, but they have a lot of people and they have a lot of organizations and they have a huge demand in Toronto. So that is very true. There's a big demand in Toronto. But the Durham, Haliburton, Kawartha, Pine Ridge catchment area, which is this area, we have our own budget. And every catchment area in the province has its own budget. So we're not moving money back and forth between catchment areas. So if I gave that impression, I'm sorry. At the beginning of the year, the board of directors assigns the budgets to each geographic area, and that's how much money our volunteer team has to work with in any given year. For the Resilient Communities Fund, we had the seed stream in February. So we actually carried out and completed the applications and the granting for that seed stream. So some of our money went to the seed stream this fiscal year. All of the remaining funds are set aside for this fiscal year for the Resilient Communities Fund, and roughly half the money will be spent on the applications submitted in September, and roughly the other half will be spent on applications for December 2nd. So just to explain that we're not going to spend 90% of the money on the first round and have 10% left for the second. So it's roughly in the middle. We'll have roughly the same amount of money for both of those time periods. So I hope that helped to explain, but feel free to submit another question if I wasn't clear about that, or if you have an added question for that. I had the chance to catch the tail end of the last, I think it was Peter's presentation. And one of his questions, or one of the questions from one of his participants, had to do with word counts, which can be very, very frustrating to work within. I totally get it. You know, I'm one of those people that if I can say something with 20 words instead of 10, why wouldn't I do it, right? I mean, I like to use a lot of words when I'm writing things. So I've had to learn over time that sometimes being more concise and more succinct is more appropriate under certain situations to get your message across. And I've had to learn how to do that over time. So I just wanted to share a few tips, in addition to the tips that Peter provided, which were very good, by the way. So if you weren't part of that session, I think it's been recorded. You can go back and listen to it. It was quite a good session. And you'll hear near the end, he talks about various tips about how to take a lot of words and try to winnow them down to get within maximum word counts in fields. Some of the tips I offer people are write in a very direct way, using very direct language. So if I said the purpose of my project is, that's 6 words. If I say we aim to, that's 3 words. I just recaptured 3 words I can use to say something else. So be very direct versus indirect when you're writing. Try not to use a lot of those compound phrases in and around things. Just be very direct in your language. Try not to repeat the same information in more than one answer, because basically you're saying something, the same idea or concept twice. And when you do that, then you're wasting some of your word count that you could use those words to say something else. So try not to repeat yourself if you could possibly avoid it. On rare occasions, you actually do have to mention something a second time. That's fine, but try not to do it often, because then you're really shortchanging yourself in terms of the word count. Have someone else have a look at what you've written. I think Peter's suggestion to write it in Word first, do a word count, see where you're sitting, play with it a little bit, see if you can cut it back, make it more direct, make it more concise, and then have someone else read it who's not so close to it. They can often offer you some advice about what you might change or what you might eliminate from something if it's not adding hugely to the message you're trying to get across. So those are some of the tips that I've shared with people in the past about the word count. You know, the budget notes, don't forget that the budget notes are part of your project description. You know, so while you might need to mention in brief in the activities what kinds of costs you might have, like we need to, you know, do a request for proposals for a strategic planning consultant, you know, that's in your strategy. But any additional detail in regard to that consultant and costing and how many hours it's going to take or whatever, some of that information can go in the budget notes. So just be aware of using the budget notes and the activities questions as part of one answer, if you will, and part of one picture.
That's great, Joanne. I think that's really good advice. Sometimes being concise and direct is the best way to clearly communicate what you're doing. And I don't see any more questions in the Q&A, so I would like to thank you for your time and all the detail you have here and the great work that Ontario Trillium Foundation has been doing for a very long time. I know everyone in the charitable community appreciates all you've done, both as an organization and personally. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, Daryl, I really appreciate being asked to be here. I so miss being out on the road and being able to do these sessions in person. I just love going to communities and meeting everybody in person, and I get something really positive back from that experience of being with people. So, and I know we all do. So I'm looking forward to the day when I can come back down to Durham region and do a session in person. And in the meantime, good luck with everything, everybody, and stay safe.
Yeah. Thank you, Joanne. With that, we're going to go on break. We'll be back